Well, good morning. It's good to be with you guys. If you are ready or not, it's Christmas season, right? So hopefully that's not news to you. You're not just finding that out for the first time. We're glad you're here with us. If you are new, I just want to say welcome. My name is David Black. If we've not met, I'm the campus pastor here. Something we say at Grace, and we mean often, is that we would rather pursue God together than to pretend that we have it all together. And so what that means is if you're a follower of Jesus and you're here to connect with God, we just want to welcome you and hope that that happens for you today. If you're here and you're not sure what you think about Jesus, if you're asking questions, if you're just saying, I don't know what I believe yet, it's just an honor that you'd include us in on that conversation. So we're glad you're here too. Regardless, we would just pray that you connect with somebody else and connect with Jesus. No matter why you came, you picked a great Sunday to come because we are starting a series entitled Born for You. And before we kind of get into that and cover the introduction today, I just want to make a quick reminder/announcement for what we're doing for Christmas Eve. As you're making plans, we just want to make you aware of what we're doing. In the auditorium, or in the foyer rather, there's a Christmas tree. And on that Christmas tree are these little ornament hanging tags. They're actually reminders of our Christmas time and invitations for Christmas Eve. So for what we're doing this year, we plan to have a Christmas Eve service on Wednesday the 23rd at 6 p.m. We're doing that for a couple of reasons. One might be if you are traveling out of town this year, despite where we are, it'd be great for you to jump in ahead of time. Or if you have family coming in and you're going to another service on Christmas Eve, if you want to be a part of what we're doing, we want to make space for you. On Christmas Eve, we have two services this year, one at 4 p.m. and one at 6 p.m. And so we'd love for you to be there. If you are a regular attender of Grace Church, if you consider us your home church, here's what I would ask. Just kind of, if you would serve someone else, perhaps, if it's possible, and you're thinking, you know what, I could go to 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve, I could go to 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve. Would you choose the earlier one for us? We anticipate that because of COVID, because of people wanting to be possibly together on Christmas Eve with family, we just don't know what we're going to get at that 6 o'clock service. So we'd love to make space for them. So that's one way you could just serve someone at Christmas if you're, again, flexible. Regardless of when you show up, we'd love to have you. Born for You. It's our Christmas series. What are we talking about? I just thought maybe to kind of get things kicked off, we'd start with talking about the fact that at Christmas time, I don't know if this is true for you, but it is true of our house, Christmas time just kind of brings out a lot of lists to the top. We start making more lists. I'm not a list person, but I start making more lists at Christmas time. And our series is actually all about one list that the Bible talks about at the beginning of the first book of the New Testament in Matthew chapter 1. But before we take a look at that, I thought we could maybe play a game this morning, if that's all right, just kind of get us on the same page. So I'm going to put a list on the screen, and I'd love for you to see if you can just figure out what it's a list of or a list for. So maybe, can we try this? Okay, here's the first one. That's pretty obvious. What is this one? Anybody know? Is it you can talk, it's okay. No one's going to, what is it? Cookies. Yeah, this is a recipe for gingerbread cookies. Excellent job, okay? All right, that was the intro one. This next one may not be as easy. Here's the next one for you. A bike, plane that loops the loop. Me, I want a hula hoop. What is this? It's a wish list. It's also a song, you're right. But it is a wish list. So maybe we do these on Amazon now, but maybe when you were little, we did these on paper together. Maybe you have a loved one, you said, this is how you could serve me this Christmas. You could get me this list. That'd be helpful. What about this next one? Jimmy, Julie, Ralph, Betty, Susan, Daniel, Owen, Levi, Isla. Naughty. Okay, there you go. Those last three names, for those who don't know, they're my kids. So depending on what specific interaction you had with my children, you're right. This is either a nice or a naughty list, right? Next one. Many of you may not have these this year. Here's the next one. Shirt, shoes, toothpaste, socks, towel, jeans, umbrella. Packing list, yes, where if you were to pack and go to grandma's or grandpa's or somewhere else this Christmas season or in a different season, you might take some of these things along with you. I got two more for you. Here's another one. A little bit easier, maybe. I'm going to see this all I want for songs or a playlist. Yeah, this is a Christmas playlist. So for some of you, it's not Christmas if you don't hear All I Want for Christmas Is You by Mariah Carey. For some of you, it's only Christmas if you never hear that song. So whichever side of the room you fall on, right? Here's the last one. It's a little bit more tricky. Anybody willing to admit this? They know what this is? Anyone know? Yes, somebody said it. Say it again louder. It's a Hallmark Christmas movie list. All right? This is, yeah, I know. You don't want to admit it, but when you're by yourself, it's great. When you're with others, you're like, this is a little awkward. Like watching this. It's a little cheesy, right? These are all lists. Well, some of you may not know, but Christmas starts with a list. Matthew, who was one of Jesus' followers, when he wrote his good news of Jesus, actually began his list at the very first chapter in the very first section of the New Testament. And that's where we're going to be throughout the entire series. We're going to base our whole series off of this list. Now, if you've never read through the Bible, that's okay. If you've never read this list before, that's okay. And I would understand why, because here's the list. It's pretty daunting. Like, you're going, am I supposed to be able to see that, to read that? No, that's just all of it. This is a genealogy. So this is the descendants from Abraham all the way to Jesus. And Matthew puts this list in his beginning intro. Now, go back for a second, if you don't mind, to that big list here. So some of you have friends, and they may be exploring Jesus, and they might say, hey, how can I learn to read the Bible, or where should I start? Should I just start at Matthew chapter 1? And you took a look at Matthew chapter 1, and you're going, no, how about you start in John or somewhere else, right? Some of you think the Christmas story begins at chapter 2 with the wise men and Mary and Joseph. But Matthew was a tax collector. Here's what that means. His job was making lists. His job was to keep accounts. And so when Matthew the tax collector makes his gospel and starts it with a list as his job, it should probably make us go, Matthew, why would you do that? There's a couple reasons for that. The first one would be cultural. Okay, so Matthew is making a cultural list here that people would understand what this means. For you, a genealogy may not mean that much. It might be a hobby. But for a Jewish person, because Matthew is a Jewish person writing to a Jewish audience, genealogies were like resumes. They're like a demonstration of your past. So people would take a look at your past family, your tribe, your clan, and they'd say, oh, we've seen some great accomplishments. Here's what we could expect of you. In fact, if you're from an Eastern culture, you might understand that more, because there is an obligation for you to inherit or live up to or attain something that may have happened in the past and been handed down to you from your family members. And in the same way that we would expect great things from somebody who has a great resume, you would expect great things from someone who has a great genealogy. So when Matthew starts with Matthew 1, verse 1, and says, the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, and he mentions David, who was like the most famous king in the Old Testament, and Abraham, someone whom what promise of God was given to in the Old Testament, two big pillars of the faith in Judaism and in Christianity. If that was on the resume that was slid across the table to you, you take a second look at it. You kind of go, oh, I don't know who this Jesus guy is, but David and Abraham, I might Google this guy's name. I might look and see who his Facebook friends are with. I might see, I'll take another look at this resume. It's culturally significant there. Now, what's interesting is what they would do with their genealogies is what you and I do with our resumes. We highlight the good stuff, and we hide the bad stuff. And so in the same way that it was cultural for them, it was also purposeful. He's intentionally picking certain people and putting them on the list. Now look, if you come from a family, right? You come from a family where maybe there might be a friend or a cousin or an aunt or an uncle who isn't like the most, gracious, or maybe had a falling out. There's someone, chances are, in your family that you whisper about, right? And by the way, if there's not someone in your family that you whisper about, you might You might be that person. I don't know how to break that to you this morning. That could be you, right? Or there's some event in family functions that you just don't talk about, like the surgery or the Denver incident or the like whatever it is. You just kind of refer to it as short, that one time, right? Because we're not going to go into that. Hey, everyone's coming over for Thanksgiving. Everyone's coming over for Christmas. Let's not talk about that one time, okay? Right? And you learn that pretty quick as a kid. And so intentionally, people would hide bad people from their genealogy in the same way where if there was a job that you just ghosted on or you left in a bad way, you kind of leave that off your resume. You want to put your best foot forward. You say, well, why does that matter? Well, what Matthew does is the opposite. Matthew intentionally goes and finds some of the worst people that you could put on a list and puts them on this list. He doesn't leave out all the bad stuff. He intentionally puts it in. In fact, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3 through 6, we see this. It says, and Judah the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Aminadab, and Aminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Solomon, and Solomon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David, the king, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And that's just 3 verses of 17, right? You're proving your point on why I don't read this. Thank you for that. What's going on here? Well, he puts people who no one would ever put. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and someone called the wife of Uriah. Now, what's significant about this is, one, these are women. Every one of these highlighted names is a woman. You say, well, what's wrong with women? Nothing's wrong with women. But back in that day and age, women were not listed on genealogies. You say, well, that's unfair. Well, that was the world they lived in. In other words, it would have not gained you anything, and it would have detracted from you by putting a female on this list. On top of that, every one of these female names is an outsider. So they were someone who was not a Jewish individual, or they married into a non-Jewish family. So they were a Moabite. Ruth was a Moabite. Rahab was a Canaanite. Tamar was also a Canaanite. The wife of Uriah married a Hittite. These are all names that are not Jewish names. And you're like, oh, they would be marginalized, people without a voice. And you're like, I didn't think women had a voice anyways at that time. They didn't. And on top of that, they were marginalized, voiceless people. And if that's not enough, every one of these individuals has a story that was surrounded by sexual immorality. These are not the great stories of the Bible where you're going, oh, that's amazing. So Tamar slept with her father-in-law. That's a story we'll talk about next week. You want to be here for that one, probably. Rahab, everywhere else in the Bible is called Rahab the harlot, right? Ruth became brought into the family through a series of suffering and death, and Uriah's wife is involved in a murder and adulterous affair. And that's all there. You're going, well, if that's the case, then what is going on? I mean, these are not the kids, these are not the people that you would want your kids to dress up as in the Christmas pageant, right? No one's kid is coming home from the kindergarten play going, what part did you get? I got Rahab the harlot. You're not okay with that. You're not. No one is making nativity figures of these women, right? There's a sheep and the wise men, and there's the prostitute, and there's the incest lady. That's not there. That's not a thing. So why does Matthew intentionally go and get them and put them in? And here's kind of what the whole series is about, right? And so today's kind of the introduction. Right? The whole series is about this, that not only is it cultural, and not only is it purposeful, but here's what I think Matthew knows. This is incredibly powerful. That these women, they're not being singled out. They're actually being employed as signposts. Matthew puts their names as signposts. You say, well, why would he want to put a signpost there? Here's why. Because the people that Jesus was born from have a lot to say about who he was born for. And so the entire Christmas season, we're going to ask this question. What does who Jesus was born from say about who he was born for? And what does it show us? And what does it tell us? And here's why that's so important. Because it could be for you that Christmas is when it clicks. It could be for you that this whole thing about church and this whole thing about God and this whole thing about people and the Old Testament and the New Testament and what are these 12 tribes? And I'm so confused. Christmas could be the season this year when it clicks for you. So here's what we're going to do with the time that we have left this morning. We're going to try to answer that question. What does this have to say about who he's born for? By looking at one of the specific women here. And it's going to set up the rest of our series. And we'll wrap up and go home. You say, well, what woman are we looking at? Well, we're going to take a look at Uriah's wife. You know, she's not named in this text, actually. And you're going, well, why is she not named? Well, this should tell you something. She's not named because she's actually perhaps one of the most famous and well-known stories in this series of lists. In fact, she's not named intentionally because of the awkwardness and the ambiguity that's around this. And so if you know who Rabbi Zacharias was, he was an apologist. He had a famous phrase that he would say all the time. He said in where he was from, in his country, he said there's two ways to touch your nose. He said you could touch it this way or you could touch it the long way around, right? And he said what Matthew is doing here is he's touching the nose the long way around. He's intentionally phrasing this as Uriah's wife to communicate something. Because here's what everyone knew. Historically, Uriah's wife was a woman named Bathsheba. And if you grew up in church, you're like, I know that story. And they did too. And here's what Uriah's wife would be short code for. Here's what he's saying, but not saying. You would have seen the phrase Uriah's wife, and here's what you would have thought. Murder and adultery. You would have thought murder and adultery. You're saying, what? Yeah, because. Not because of the wonderful things she does, right? Because back in the Old Testament, there's a story about David the king, the most famous king, and one of his generals named Uriah, and Uriah's wife. I'm going to tell it to you quickly. If you've never grown up in church, here's what you need to know. David was anointed to be king. That means he was singled out to be the next king. But the king who was on the throne at the time hated him and was actually seeking to kill him because he didn't want to give up his throne. And so David ran into the wilderness. And when he did that, he actually gathered a group of bandits and outcasts around him. And they became known as his mighty men or his fighting men. They were literally in the wilderness with him. They helped fight and defend him and hide him. One of those guys' name was Uriah. Uriah was not a follower of God at first. In fact, he wasn't a Jewish person. He was a Hittite. He was from the land of Canaan. And although he himself was an outcast, and although he himself didn't have any reason to be in this fight, he actually attached himself to David, and over the life of David, defended him, fought next to him, became a friend of him, and when David inherited the palace and finally became king, Uriah went with him. And Uriah was fighting in a battle far from home when this happened. This is what we're told in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2 through 5. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived. And she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." Now, I don't know what Real Housewives you're watching or what soap or I don't know what you're into, right? But here's what I do know. This is probably up there with it. Don't read this in black and white. Don't read this in color. Don't see this just in 2D. This is legitimately something's going down here, right? Remember? So she didn't just go home and go, ding, I'm pregnant. There's time here. This plays out over time. So David, here's what David does. He knows this is not good. He actually tries to cover it up. So what he does is he calls Uriah back home from the war. And he says, Uriah, hey, take some time off. Now that you're home, you should go see your wife Bathsheba. But here's what Uriah says. Uriah goes, my friends and my brothers are fighting in a battle right now. They're sleeping in tents. I'm not going to go home and be in the comfort of my house. So here's what Uriah does. Uriah sleeps at the palace. He won't go home to his wife. So David's like, oh my goodness. So here's what David does. David decides, I'm going to get him drunk. I'm going to throw a party. I'm going to get him drunk. But here's what happens. Uriah gets drunk, and drunk Uriah is more honorable than sober David. Drunk Uriah goes, I'm not going home. I'm sleeping right here at the palace. And so David sees that this is useless. He can't cover this up. This isn't working out for him. So here's what he does. 2 Samuel following, it says this. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab. Joab was the captain of the army. And sent it by the hand of Uriah. So Uriah's taken this note. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. That is cold. The king sent his friend, his defender, of probably at least 20 years, back to the battle with a note that says, kill the man holding this note. And what's interesting is Joab doesn't do exactly what David says, but he does enough. And Uriah dies. After Uriah is dead, Bathsheba comes to the palace. They are wed, and she gives birth to children for David. Now, that's the story of Uriah's wife. You're like, why in the world would Matthew put that on Jesus's resume? And why did no one ever really say something else about that, right? Come on. Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I think the first is this. I think what Matthew's trying to say is this, that nobody deserves to be on the list. Nobody deserves to be on the list. Back then, as I said, genealogies were about pedigree. They were a point of pride. And so people would argue back and forth who they descended from. I descended from the great, philosopher, or I descended from the great, right? So here's what you wanted. You wanted David to be on your list because he was like the king. In fact, in Matthew's list, that big one that I showed you, there were tons of kings in there. Not just one, a lot of kings. But there's only one that was called the king. Look at what he says. And Jesse, the father of David, the king. Not a king, not one of the kings, the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. So what's going on there? Well, just in the same way, right? Like you would send in maybe a sample of your DNA, and you'd want it 23andMe and figure out did I come from Scotland? Did I come from Ireland? Did I come from Europe, Central Asia? Where's my family from, right? And maybe you got something back that said, you descended from an Irish noble. And you're like, great. And you start telling everybody that until you find out all of Ireland was ruled by nobles, so kind of everybody from Ireland's a noble. Anyway, that whole deal, there are people who would do that with their Jewish genealogies back then. And so here's what would happen. If you were someone like that and you were reading Matthew's list about this Messiah Jesus guy, you'd start going down the list. You'd be like, Abraham, yeah. Tamar. And you go, oh. I go, okay, let's keep going. You go further and you get, oh, Rahab? Nope. Next. Ruth? Right? And you'd be like, who is this? Why are these people here? These women don't deserve to be here. And then you get to Uriah's wife. And here's what Matthew's saying. He's going, David, your king? David, the guy that everybody wants to be related to? David, the guy who everybody wants on their genealogy? People would line up and kill to be on that genealogy. That guy, your hero, that guy, the one that you think deserves, yeah. Uriah's wife? And you go, oh. See, nobody deserves to be on the list. Here's the truth. Someone said this, and I love it the way they said it. They said this looks more like a lineup than it does a lineage. This isn't a list of great people. You read the list. There are kings on this list who led the country into idolatry and caused horrible things to happen to the people of Israel in that time. It's not just one person. This is a whole list of guilty people, a whole list that don't deserve to be there. Now you say, well, okay, what's the point? Well, the point is that we're all guilty. When you look at this list, every one of people on this list is guilty of something, and the same is true for you and me. If you grew up in church, maybe you grew up in church reading the Old Testament this way. Maybe somewhere along the lines it was like communicated to you, maybe not out loud, but maybe through the culture, that the Old Testament is a book about people who were like you and me, who followed God, and these were the good people. So the people in the Old Testament, they're the good ones. They made the Old Testament. They're the people that we hold up and say, be like Abraham, be like David, be like Joseph. And that's the purpose for the Old Testament. That is not the purpose for the Old Testament. Because if you start reading the Old Testament, here's what you find out. Abraham was a liar. Jacob was a cheat. David was a murderer and an adulterer. Elijah was a wreck. You go on the list and you go, well, what is this for? Here's why. The Old Testament is not an example of good people. It is an example that none of us are good. That all the people we could find, even the best ones, we don't make the cut. See, at the end of the day, we are all guilty. At the end of the day, we're all in the same boat. There's not one person that we could put on a platform and go, they deserve to be there, because no one deserves to make God's list. When it comes to God's list, it's not you, it's not me, it's none of them. So what in the world? Well, here's the truth. What we do with the Old Testament, you and I do the same thing with Christmas. You say, what? Our culture does the same thing with Christmas. What do we do at Christmas time? We say Christmas, and here's what we say about Christmas time. Christmas is a time, it's just a time to remember that we need to be a little bit better. We just need to be a little bit more generous, a little bit nicer. You know, maybe we think of those who are lesser than us at Christmas time. Christmas is a reminder to be good to one another. That's what Christmas is for. Christmas was given to us by God to remember, be nice and be good. And that is not true at all. In fact, the purpose of Christmas is because we are not good. The purpose of Christmas is that we are so not good and we are so guilty that God had to do something. He had a purpose for it. He had to actually get involved in our life. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus and you're here and you've been like trying to figure out what it means to follow God, even if you're interacting with like, oh, hey, I'm not perfect all the time, and I know that even if you're not a follower of Jesus, I think sometimes here's how we think. We think that like the devil is out there maybe trying to get us to do bad things. But here's what I've found to be true, and it's true for me, maybe true for you. It's a lot easier for him just to convince me that I'm good than to try to get me to do bad. In fact, the enemy doesn't have to convince you to be bad if he can convince you that you're really just okay and good. Right? You're just sitting there like, hey, you want to rob a bank this week? Nope, not doing that. Why not? Because I'm a good person. He's got you. He's got you. Hey, do you want to fill in the blank? Nope, why not? Because I'm a decent person. Nope. He's got you. He doesn't have to convince you to do anything bad. All he has to do is convince you that you're good enough to not be in need of grace. You see, at the end of the day, here's what's the truth. We're all just trying to throw rocks to Canada. You'd say, what? Yeah, imagine for a second that I said we're going to have $1 million contest. To win $1 million, all I need you to do is throw a rock to Canada. And you're like, I don't think that's possible, but I'm going to try, right? And depending on your personality, you might do a couple things. There are people who would hear that and go, you know what, I need to train. So I'm going to go home and I'm going to train. I'm going to find the equipment. I'm going to develop a workout regime, and I'm going to build muscle in my arm, my throwing arm, because I'm going to win this. Other people would say, it doesn't matter how long I train, but I do have a brother or an uncle, and you know what? They're in the throwing business. They play baseball. They play Major League Baseball. So I'm going to go get that brother, and they're going to come in, and they're going to be my person who I point to, and they're going to throw the rock for me. That's what they're going to do, right? Other people would say, you know what, there's no point to it, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Some people would say, I'm going to go study science and physics, and I'm going to somehow, through science and physics, come up with some machine or some scientific way to best throw this rock. And then there's the other person who's like, I don't even believe in rocks, right? And so we're all in this contest together, but here's the truth, and you know this. This is ridiculous. It's ridiculous because no matter how good of a rock thrower you are, or how scientific you are, or what relation you are to a family member, no one is making it to Canada because we live in Georgia. And the farthest I can throw it is probably somewhere in the parking lot. That's it. See, the same thing is true for you and for me when it comes to our life and our goodness. We're all, maybe I can throw it a little bit farther than you, maybe you can throw it a little bit farther than me, but none of us are making it. And that's what Matthew's saying. He puts Uriah's wife on the list to tell you and to me, David, the king, he threw the farthest, he threw the hardest, he didn't make it. You know what the truth is? The honest truth? If you were to be honest, and this wasn't a church, and I wasn't a pastor, and you were to be honest with me, here's what I think is true for you. It's true for me. You have a Uriah's wife. I have one too. Something in our past that we don't want anyone to know about, something that we think that would take us down from a pedestal in a second, in an instant, if someone saw it and someone knew it. And so we don't bring it up and we hide it and we don't mention it. We all have one. You say, well, what do I do with that? Well, that's the second thing that Matthew, I think, is telling us here. The first is that, none of us deserve to be on the list. The second one is this, that when it comes to failure, no failure, no matter how big, is final. That's what he's saying here. You say, well, what do you mean? Well, if you think about it, that was the worst thing that he could think of to put on this list, and David still made the list. You're like, I don't get it. No one deserves to be on the list, but he's on the list. Judah doesn't deserve to be on the list, but he's on the list. Why are they here? And I think the point that Matthew's trying to make is this, that God is not working in spite of our sin. God works at the very point of our sin. You say, well, what do you mean? Well, in the Old Testament, do you know what the Messiah, the promised person who Jesus was, do you know what he was called? He was not called the son in spite of David. Do you know what he's called? The son of David. Sometimes he'd be called the Lion of Judah, not the Lion in spite of Judah, the Lion of Judah. You say, what's going on? See, it's not just that Jesus Christ came from people who did bad things. It's that out of the bad things that people did, Jesus Christ came. Does that make sense? That God used his power of redemption and his power of sovereignty is so unstoppable that our worst failures and our deepest faults were not able to prevent him from bringing about his redemptive plan to save humanity. That son that eventually came out of that whole affair, that son died. The second son that was born to Bathsheba, Solomon. And from Solomon, we're down the line all the way to Jesus. You say, okay, so what? Well, here's the truth. Our world, if you think about this, here's what you know. Our world is not tolerant of bad people. We're tolerant of a lot of things. But bad people, however you want to classify that, at different times, in different places, it's been classified. When it comes to bad people, we're not tolerant of them at all. You see, when it comes to failure, accidental failure we live with. We get that, right? So if you've seen, no one paid me from Allstate to say this, but if you've seen an Allstate accident forgiveness commercial, you're familiar with this idea, right? In fact, it's a picture, and then, you might have somebody, and they're standing there, and their car's crunched up against the side of the highway, and steam's coming up from the engine, and they're sitting there, and they're going, oh, I wish this didn't happen. And up walks the guy from Allstate, and he goes, it didn't happen. And you're like, it did. It's right here. And they said, nope, with Allstate's accident forgiveness plan, this never happened. And you're like, oh, good, great, right? And so like everyone wants to go with Allstate because they'll just go, well, never really happened. We get accidental stuff. We're willing to be past accidental stuff. What happens with unimaginable stuff? What happens with unforgettable stuff? What happens with intentional stuff? What do we do with intentional failure? What do we do with unimaginable failure? What do we do with epic failure? We got nowhere to put it. It's like nuclear waste, right? We have no clue. Like, hey, it's a great power source, but it puts out all this stuff that's really toxic. What should we do with it? Bury it. Okay, they bury it. Fast forward 20 years. Shouldn't have buried it. Bad things. What are we going to do with it now? Let's put it in the water. It's a great idea. Let's throw it in the water. Fish can eat it. Turns out we eat fish, and it's bad for them too. Shouldn't have done it. Well, maybe we can pay someone to take it. Well, who are we going to pay to take nuclear waste? I don't know. I'm not sure, right? Maybe we could sell it. Would you take that job? Selling nuclear waste? You're like, I'm a great salesman. What do I need to sell? Nuclear waste. Nope. See you later. Bye. Now we hide it and burn it. Like, it's the same thing with our failure. We bury it. What should I do with this failure? Bury it. What should we do for the failure? You should pay for it. Figure out somebody else to buy it. What should I do with this failure? Hide it. Never bring it up again. Don't ever mention it. Why do we do that? We do that because we know. We know that our world has no answer for it. We know that our society and culture is intolerant of bad people. That's why people are canceled, because someone found out the nuclear waste in their life. Boom. Following. Gone. Platform. Gone. We love it when people are one way, and as soon as we find out their faults and failures, talk about social distancing, right? No one wants that. And you know that too. That's why you hide it. That's why somebody told you to get religion, because eventually, you can make up for it. That's why somebody said, just move past it, try to outrun it. Some of you are trying to outrun it, and in your 30s, and you're tired, and it's hurting, and you don't know what's going on. You can't outrun it. Somebody said, try to give it to somebody else. Blame someone else for it. It's not mine, it's theirs. Like, look, we do it. We try to manage it, and it does not work. The message of Christmas and what Matthew is saying is that there is a God of the universe who came to rid you of it, who came to take it himself. The Bible calls that grace. Grace is God giving us a gift that you don't deserve. Don't deserve to be on the list. God doesn't deserve to take your failure upon himself, but he does that. Author Paul Tripp says this. He says, sin is the problem. Forgiving grace is the solution. Christ is born to make that grace available to all who believe. You know who got this? Maybe better than you and me? Matthew. You know who Matthew was? Tax collector, a traitor to his countrymen, a cheat, a thief. Matthew was a tax collector, and people would run from him. They would shun him. He wasn't allowed to worship in the temple, and yet Jesus shows up at his house. Jesus is at his house, and he's eating with Matthew, and some religious leaders come by, and they look at Matthew, and they look at Jesus, and they go, this man eats with sinners. This man eats with failures. This man parties with people who are guilty. And here's what Jesus says. Jesus says this, but when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. He quoted the Old Testament. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. That's why Jesus came. Here's the good news of Christmas, and here's why Jesus is born. God writes sinners into his story. That's what he does. That's what Matthew's trying to get across here. That God intervened on behalf of you and me. You say, really? Yeah, really, that's what God did. Well, how would I know that's what God did? How is Matthew trying to communicate that? Well, in verse 17, we're given a clue. Verse 17, here's what he says. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. You go, okay, what's that supposed to tell me? Well, here's what you need to know. When we look at this timeline, we know that there's more than just these generations. In other words, Matthew intentionally left people off the list. So what actually is going on in this passage, when you read it, when it says so-and-so was the father of, that word literally just means born from or born after. And so what he's doing is he's intentionally picking grandparents and then maybe mentioning grandkids. He's ordering this in a specific way. Really? You expect me to believe that? Yeah, he's a tax collector. If Matthew makes a bad list, Rome is unhappy. Nobody wants to make Rome unhappy. So he knows about lists. He's doing this on purpose, and he even includes this little instruction manual at the end. Well, what is he doing? Why is he doing that? So just for a second, and as we're wrapping up, I'm just going to require you to think for a minute. Okay, I know it's 11-ish, and we're in, but here's what we see. If you were to look at this, here's what it would look like. So he'd say from the beginning to David, 14 generations. So there's this first chunk up there that shows, 14 generations. And then he'd say, and then from David to the deportation, 14 more generations. And then from the deportation back to Jesus, 14 more generations. And you're going, okay. Can't you see it? Isn't that clear? No, that's not clear at all. What's going on? Well, here's what you need to know. In Jewish times and in Judaism, and the people of the day would have associated numbers for certain meanings. And so not only do we just see that God has been faithful through all these generations, but here's what we see. The number 7 specifically means completion or rest. And the reason they would think of that is because back in Genesis, God created the world in 6 days. On the 7th, he rested. It symbolized rest, completion, freedom. And it symbolized rest so much that every 7 years in the life of the Jewish people, there was what was called a Sabbath year. In other words, every 7 years, your debts would be canceled. How awesome would that be? Every 7 years, no student loan debt. Every 7 years, no more business debt. Every 7 years, no more mortgage payment. That'd be pretty sweet. Bondservants would be freed at some point. This 7 years cycle would continue until you got to the 7th 7 year. Okay, everyone there? So every 49 years, right, there would be what they would call a year of Jubilee. And in that year, no crops would be planted, no fields would be worked. You would have a year-long holiday. Right? It's like the anti-opposite 2020, right? Like it was the flip. If everything you wish 2020 was not, that's that year, right? Joy and feasting and freedom and debtlessness. It was tremendous, right? But it was the 7th 7 of the cycle. Now, go back to Matthew quickly. There's 3 sets of 14. How many 7s is that? And 6. 6, that's right. Which makes Jesus Christ on the list the 7th 7. See what he's doing? He's saying, you want rest? You want freedom? You want the completion of what you're looking for? You want the promise of God come full circle? You want to see what God has been up to in creating? It's Jesus. You see, to a Jewish person, the list probably looks something like this. You see it, right? Instantly. That's a Christmas tree. Back then, they'd look at that and go like, why is there a triangle with a square? But you and I see it. And that's what his readers saw it. That in Jesus Christ, God is bringing about the redemption for you and for me. You see, the people that Jesus was born from were sinners, but that's not just it. Jesus was born for sinners. The people that Jesus was born from were a lot like you and me. And the people that Jesus is born for are exactly you and me. The first missionary of the church put it this way. He said this in 1 Timothy 1:15. He said this. The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the foremost. Some of your versions say like archetype, poster child. Now, I don't know what you have done. I don't know your past, and I don't know your story. But here's what I think I do know. I think that if you were honest and alone, there are times in your life where you would go, yeah, I didn't kill anyone, I didn't rob a bank, but it feels like I'm the foremost. And the reason I know it feels like you're the foremost is because that's how it feels like for me. And when I see my list, I go, what hope is there? And God goes, yeah, I've taken a look at your list. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to save you from a life of lists, trying to work your way out of it. I'm trying to be better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to save you from a life of lists because I'm going to give you my list. And the whole point of my list is that it's for sinners because it has a Savior in Jesus. Listen, you might be here and you might struggle with self-righteousness. You might look at the gospel and hear the gospel and go, oh, this again, it's just watered down. That's elementary stuff. When are we going to get to the good stuff? Jesus was born for you. You might hear and you struggle with self-reliance. You're like, I got this. Christianity, the gospel, Jesus, that's all weak stuff, man. That's a crutch. Jesus was born for you. Maybe you're here and your issue is that you're self-aware. You're too self-aware. You're like, I know exactly what I did. And to you, Christmas sounds like wishful thinking. Jesus was born for you. Say, how do I know that? Because the one who was born for your sin, he bore your sin on the cross. The one who was born for you died for you. And he took your place so that you might be brought into his family. And here's the great thing. Not only does God write sinners into his stories, God still writes them into their story. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're like, that's how I got here. That's me. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, he offers you his grace. The word genealogy, when Matthew says to be the book of the genealogy, the word there is beginning. That's where we get our word Genesis. So Matthew says the book of the beginning of the story of Jesus. I think it's interesting. I think he does that to communicate to you that, like, listen, no matter your past, no matter what's in the back of your life, in Jesus Christ, it's a new beginning for you. So I'm going to pray that God would use this series in your life. You might be using it right here today. Maybe you need to have a conversation with him right here when I pray. Maybe there's somebody in your life who you've been praying for, and you got to tell them, man, God is born for sinners. I'm going to pray that God would give you a no-brainer moment this Christmas to talk about that. That we as a church would go, man, God, you are too good. We don't deserve it. But you and your grace have brought us in. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for Christmas. We thank you that it's much more than just simply good feelings, being nice. Lord, we thank you that in it we find the solution to our heart's problem, our world's problem, your plan of redemption and salvation. For the person who's here and you're talking right to them right now this morning, God, would they find repentance? Would they wrap their arms around your love?